do it when you push the button?
You muted, Red.
No, it didn't. I didn't hear anything to say that it had started recording, but it
John,
is recording.
It did, John, when you did it. So I think it probably is the
Yeah.
blanket announcement.
Right.
Okay. All right. So Ed and Gordy, do you have in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you got the word recording with a red dot blinking?
Yes.
Okay, good. And Frank, do you want to record it?
I don't know what I'd do with it, but I can, yeah. So I can click on record. The more the merrier. All
Click
right.
on record. I just allowed it. Click on record and see if you up in the upper left if it says recording with a blinking red light.
It says recording. Yeah.
John, it says recording if anybody is recording.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll find out later. I mean, it's not so critical for me, but
Okay.
it wouldn't hurt to have a recording available. So anyway, I'm going to start sharing my screen.
All right, go ahead.
Without further ado.
And mute everybody.
Yeah. All right. Wait a minute.
Yeah, I think Charles Beckett is a culprit with the noise.
I know, and we've talked about that, and it's he's got no noise. He's in his house. There is no noise. I don't know why it does that. All right, I'm going to mute everybody, and you unmute yourself if you want to ask Frank a question, and Frank, you unmute yourself so you can talk.
Okay, I should be unmuted now. Can everybody hear me? Just nod your heads.
I can't hear you.
Okay. Now I'm back on.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, tonight we're going to do something a little different than the typical Sono Tower presentations. There's no three-quarter views of locomotives. There is a structured talk that describes what people who are agent and operators did at depots. And even though this is designed to show Norfolk and Western Railway depots, long way from the New Haven and the Pensy and the PRSL and anywhere else, nonetheless, the responsibilities and activities that were performed by the agent operators were pretty similar. So, for those who worked in a tower, but never worked in an agency, this maybe gives a glimpse of what that other person was doing. No levers involved other than the train order levers. And, for the general rail fan who really has never seen a working station, my view is that about 80% of people who like rail fanning like locomotives. And then you break it down a little further, and some people like dining cars and sleeping cars and such as that. A few get into freight cars. When you really get down to it, there's very, very few people that have gone out and taken pictures of structures, and even fewer actually have an awareness. I was very fortunate that during the summers of 1971, 72, and 73, I worked for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway on the Richmond Division and learned agent operator activities as they existed in the 70s, which was very similar to 50 years earlier than the 1970s into the 1920s than it is 50 years later to today. Essentially there are no station agents anymore. There's no operators. There's none of the stuff that I'm about to talk about. So what we're going to do is there's an overview that we'll give, and then we'll talk about the various functions such as passenger service, freight service, Railway Express, Western Union, railroad operations, and that other favorite railroad term called other duties as assigned, and then we'll summarize. Now, the other thing is all these slides have a background picture that's Norfolk and Western related. This is a group of clerks at a station that was probably one of the larger stations that was handling a lot of furniture loading, for example, or other merchandise traffic. So, adding machines were the rigor of the day, and everything was pen and ink and adding machines. So as far as the overview goes, I'm not going to read this, but basically the bottom line is that no matter what railroad you're on, no matter when, the expectation that the agent and any of the clerks, they had to be agreeable with the public. And, if there are questions, even unreasonable questions, they're to be answered with politeness and courtesy. There was some conversation earlier about, the airline people taking over in the railroad, but I think that's one of the toughest jobs about a gate agent is you have some people who can really act poorly and make unreasonable requests. And nonetheless, the gate agent has to do what they can to be polite and courteous. And certainly it was that way with the railroad station agent and all the station employees. Now, for the most part, there's very few depot buildings around. There are some that have are still in museums. The carload freight agency work has been centralized. A lot of times it's even computerized where you go online and you prepare your shipment information. So that doesn't exist anymore. There's no such thing as telegram, express, and less than carload freight. That's all completely gone. Operator responsibilities are obsolete because especially when the introduction of centralized traffic control came, you no longer had operators having to OS trains at stations. They may still have, but it really wasn't essential because in CTC territory, the dispatcher knew where all the trains were and may have even had a graphing mechanism attached to their CTC machine that was tracking where trains were at particular times. And there are also a few people who are aware of all the functions that were done in a depot. Now, one particular note, I'm not going to say a lot about all of the background slides, but I will make a mention here. The top signal is the block signal. This is in the era when there was no automatic block signals on the Norfolk and Western Railway, no centralized traffic control. So you had the purpose of an operator was to provide blocking for trains. So that's what the top signal is. It's a block signal. And then the lower signal that's under the word have and landscape, you can barely see it. That was the train order signal. This little place here is, you can't read the whole name of it, but it's Solitude. And it lives up to its name. The James River is over to the right behind the trees. It's the end of a passing siding, and it's at the end of the road in Central Virginia in Botetourt County, about 30 miles north of Roanoke. And all it was just a telegraph office. There were no passengers getting on there or off. There was no freight work. It was solely an operating office. And of course, those were the ones that were closed earliest, since they didn't have any other responsibilities. And I've been to Solitude. There ain't much there. Population 0. So we're going to start out with some definitions just to put everybody on the same basis, because station, as anybody who's read the operating rules, is a location identified by name in the railroad employee timetable or in the open and prepaid stations tariff. So there's a difference. People call stations station buildings like the one in the background. That's really a depot. That's a building at a station which accommodated passenger, freight, express, and the other railroad operating activities. The agent was a railroad employee who could bind the railroad to a bill of lading and other transactions, such as issuing passenger transportation. That means selling tickets, but that's one of the things that I like about railroads is you don't sell tickets, you sell transportation. And the operator is a railroad employee assigned for the communications and railroad operations. So many cases at smaller depots, the agent and operator was combined. Certainly, as you know, at towers, you may have had an operator, you may have had leverman, you may have had a train director at the big towers, but the operator was the one who sat there with a telegraph or telephone equipment, communicating with the dispatcher, and then keeping everybody else in the tower informed. Well, the operator basically did the same responsibilities at a depot. And in many cases, the agent and operator responsibilities were combined. A clerk is a person who did not do any of the activities mentioned above. They didn't have, they'd never worked the wire. They never got on the phone, maybe the public telephone, perhaps. But they were a railroad employee assigned clerical and agency responsibilities, but without the ability to bind the railroad company on legal documents such as a bill of lading. And that's the important thing to recognize is the bill of lading is a legal document. And in some cases, it also showed ownership of the product. A lumper, not many people have heard what lumpers are. And it's more than just somebody who got in back street fights and giving somebody else lumps. They were the person who in a freight house provide the manual labor of moving crates around, getting it off the loading dock. And sometimes they were even hired by the agent and paid out of that agent's own wages rather than the agent having to do it. Same thing with the baggage express and mail porter. They provided manual labor, handling items onto and off of trains. And again, if the railroad didn't authorize a porter at a relatively small station, you might have the situation that the agent also would hire somebody locally. So now we'll talk to what the freight was and the other traffic. Carload freight, abbreviated CL, that's a shipment that was based upon the full utilization of a railroad car. So, your tank cars, box cars, hopper cars, flat cars, they were pretty much paid for on the basis of the entire car being utilized, even if there was only a partial load on it. Your less than carload freight pretty much disappeared in the 1950s. It was taken over by less than truckload freight, LTL freight, which is alive and well today. And that was basically crates or anything else that was larger than 70 pounds and or larger than the dimensions that Express or US Parcel Post would handle. And it was usually a much lower rate. So that was handled in peddler cars in a local freight train. And that is the reason why you look at railroad stations and they've got the, for example, the one in the background here, those doors down at the end with the loading dock, they call that the freight house because that's where the less than carload freight went. It was unloaded from a train, put into the freight house, and then consignees were notified, as I'll mention in a little bit, and the consignees would come in and pick up their freight. Transportation, that's a passenger ticket. Anytime, it was always on trains, passengers holding transportation are allowed through the train gate or whatever else. They didn't really talk much about ticket. They talked about transportation. That's what the agents sold as transportation. So for passenger service, we'll start out with that because many people at least have a passing awareness because in many cases they were passengers themselves and may continue to be. The depot agent provided route and schedule information upon request. They also prepared rate quotes and they issued tickets. Now, back in the day, a railroad agent usually knew what the rates were to all of the other stations on that railroad system. So, for example, the Norfolk and Western, the agents could sell tickets from their office without pretty much any assistance to anywhere else on the Norfolk and Western Railway system. Same for the New Haven, same for the Pennsy, and the Pennsy being a much bigger railroad, they had quite a few passenger tariffs. But when you started getting into connecting line rates, let's say you were going coast to coast and wanted to connect by way of the Burlington and then the Union Pacific, the railroad agent did not have all those tariffs. And so what they would do is they would go to the general passenger agent's office, in this case, Roanoke, but I'm supposing that for the New Haven Railroad, it was at New Haven, Connecticut or someplace. And they would request the quote by the inner line, all the inner line rates. And then, if they actually wanted the tickets, that general passengers agent's office would send the tickets by railroad business mail to the agent, who would then in turn sell it. So back in the day, it was very seldom, unless you were just going locally on the railroad, that you would walk up to the ticket counter and say, I want a train for the next ticket. You almost always had to plan your trips well in advance, give the information to the agent, the travel dates, your destination. If you didn't specify a routing, their obligation was to provide the lowest cost overall routing. And in many cases, rates were matched among the major railroads, let's say going to the West Coast or down to Texas. And so you would then give them that information. They'd send it by railroad business mail and then get the response a day or two later. And you go back and pick up the ticket, and then you're ready to also travel. And they also recommended that you didn't just take your luggage down the day you were departing. They almost always recommended that you take your luggage down and give it to the agent for checking, so that it went on whatever trains did handle baggage service, because not all trains did. And that way you were pretty sure that your bag would be waiting for you at the destination. So a lot of different expectations between the now and the then. And when I'm talking about then, 1950s and before. The agent had the responsibility of updating the arrival departure board that was on the side of the station for if a train was on time or delayed. They would be out on the platform anyway. If there were passengers to be picked up and it was a flag stop, they were the ones to flag the train when requested. And of course, they had to maintain passenger comfort in the waiting room. Now, one little tidbit, and I can't verify that it's actually true or a specific railroad. It's one of those things in railroad lore. There was a general superintendent that in the era before photographs, many people really didn't know what the general superintendent or even the president of the railroad looked like. And so the general superintendent had just been appointed. And so he was traveling the system to familiarize himself with the territory, and stopped by this station. It was a winter day, and he went on in, and the coal stove in the waiting room was absolutely cold. It was frigid outside, and it was nearly the same temperature on the inside. So, he walked up to the ticket window and asked the agent, can't you get the fire going in the stove, And the agent operator said, well, I don't have time to do that. I've got this large stack of telegrams. I got, other things I've got to do. I've got to get to that. I'm not going to fool around with that right now. I'll get to it when I get to it. And so the guy didn't identify himself as the general superintendent. He just said, well, I've got a telegram to send if you can give me a form. And so he gave him the form, and he wrote out to the superintendent of stations, please relieve agent such and so at such and so for dereliction of duty, and signed it, his name as general superintendent, handed it to the operator, and the operator looked at it and said, hey, I can't send that message. And the general superintendent said, why not? And he responded, well, I've got to get the fire going in that damn stove. So anyway, that's the levity for tonight. That's my one crackerjack story to tell for sure. So anyway, of course, carload freight was the bread and butter. The railroads were not really making money on passenger travel. And I should say, back for the passenger service, if you wanted to ride a sleeping car, Yeah, you could do a step upgrade when you got on the train. But if you wanted a Pullman reservation, a lot of times, again, you had to go down, tell that you wanted to travel by sleeper, and it required getting on the message line or sending railroad business mail to make the sleeping car reservation and get the Pullman tickets, because the Pullman tickets were sold from the Pullman company and not necessarily from the general passenger agent's office. So anyway, back to carload freight. If you were a consignee, they could provide the freight routing and schedule information. They'd also prepare rate quotes. They could tell you, they had a file of system and connecting line tariffs for the commodities that were usually handled at the station. And if they didn't, they would request quotes from the general freight agent's office at Roanoke or whatever the main office was for the railroad being discussed for non-recurring shipments.
Hey, Frank,
Yeah,
Frank,
I'm
I'd like
listening.
to ask a question.
Yep.
Okay. And Chris Hausler, I think, might be able to answer the question. In obviously that picture was taken a long time ago when there was telegraph involved, and I'm looking at the phone pole on the right hand side of the screen, and it looks like a birdhouse up at the top, and I'm a little curious about that, and if maybe Chris knows the answer.
If he doesn't, I do. Chris, go ahead.
Well,
I
it's,
know you know the answer.
it's the junction box where the wires would be brought together into a cable to drop into the station.
It was
Remember,
also called a dry spot.
remember a telegraph wire is a series circuit. You have to cut the wire and then bring the two ends into the station. So yeah, it's a junction box. I think there was a name for it, but I can't think of what it is right now.
Yeah,
But, you know,
well, a lot of people refer to it as the dry spot, you know, because I mean, it looks like a birdhouse. That's exactly what it does. The wires are coming off that pole going in there, and it's dry and making the connection for the cable. You could see down under the word tariffs, you could see that there's a cable that goes into the back end of the station. And one other thing that I'll mention is this is Bentonville. Bentonville was really a hot spot on the N&W Railway, because when they started putting in centralized traffic control, they started going northward out of Roanoke, and it got to Bentonville, and that's where it stopped right around World War II. So Bentonville, every train entering automatic block signal territory had to get a clearance card, and if there were any train orders, of course, that were attached to the clearance card. But it was mandatory. That's really what the train order signal was. You may not have actually had any train orders, but you actually had a clearance card that you picked up with any applicable train orders or messages. So
Okay.
go ahead.
I've never seen that in any of the pictures.
Yeah, well, you know, that's the thing. And this is an old picture, and the reason why it's an old picture is there was an act called the Valuation Act of 1913. The purpose was the Interstate Commerce Commission had no way of knowing how reasonable a freight weight was, or if a railroad was earning an adequate rate of return on investment, if it didn't know what its asset base was. So all the railroads had to go around and figure out what the value was of all the structures, all the equipment. I mean, even down to trash cans and you know, fire buckets, you name it, everything that was in the station, benches. It all had to be itemized and cataloged with a value, and it was all rolled up into the valuation for a particular station. And as a part of that, they had to go around and photograph every facility. So the nice thing is, the Norfolk and Western Railway photographs exist in a couple different places. This was true for every railroad. So the Pennsy, the New Haven, PRSL, Reading, all of these railroads had to take photographs of all the stations and towers around 1913, somewhere as late as 1916, because it took several years to go through this process. And some of these have ended up in state historical societies. Some of them were in railroad historical societies. Others were just pitched into the dumpster. But once the railroad had that, and for example, the Norfolk and Western Railway could prove that it back in 1916 had, let's say, and I'm just making up a number, $200 million worth of assets. I don't know if that's high or low. Then when they were going in for rate evaluations before the Interstate Commerce Commission, they were presumed to be able to earn up to about a 6% return on investment. Rarely did railroads actually ever earn that, but it became the benchmark for which the Interstate Commerce Commission could then, in a rate determination case, decide whether rates were just and reasonable, but also compensatory. And that was one thing that most people forget, is that railroad rates were supposed to be compensatory to the carrier. Of course, the shippers had a different view about what compensatory was. And the other thing that I'll mention about this picture, the Shenandoah Valley Railroad, my favorite, to which Boyce Depot is a home as a second generation Shenandoah Valley Railroad station. The Shenandoah Valley Railroad was built in the 1880s, and it went bankrupt in the 1890s. And but all the stations looked about like this, from top to bottom in the system. And so Boyce Depot, the original Boyce Depot, looked like this. Shenandoah Junction with the B&O Railroad station looked a little like this. They tried to modernize it some, but it basically had these features. A lot of other stations up and down the valley. So what you see here with the steps up on one end, elevated platform, and this little boxy style of building. The only difference between one station and another on the Shenandoah Valley Railroad was just the name painted on the side of the building. And again, you can see top is the block signal, and underneath the word schedule is the train order signal, which is lowered. There's no train orders here, and the block is clear, so that block signal is lowered. It's not horizontal. Well, back to the slide. So anyway, the main thing about carload freight out of a railroad station, and this worked to my advantage when I was working summers, is pretty much the shippers were all shipping the same thing week after week, month after month. And so rather than looking up rate quotes every time, they basically had a cheat sheet that showed, to this destination. For example, a lot of wood pulp was being shipped on the C&O, and it only went to 3 different destinations in Virginia. So if the consignee or the consignor said that this load of pulpwood's going down to West Point, Virginia, and then this other one's going to Covington, Virginia, you had it all laid out there on a piece of paper, and it was easy to fill out the bill of lading. In that case, the bill of lading also provided the rate information, and usually the shipment was prepaid. So it was only this rate quotes where you had some oddball shipment that it really became difficult. And of course, your backup was going to the General Freight Agent's accounting office for the non-recurring shipments, because a tariff library is huge. The Interstate Commerce Commission had to have every tariff that was in effect for every railroad for the period that it was in use, plus keep the old supplements and the old tariffs for about 5 years, I think it was, as far as the retention schedules go. I mean, they had whole rooms that were the tariff library, and these were big rooms. So in the agent's office at Boyce, there's a place called the records room, and a good portion of that was dedicated not only to storing the copies of old records, but it was where you kept whatever rates were on file, because the general public had to be able to be provided access to the tariff upon request. And if you didn't have it, then you had to refer them to the General Freight Agent's office. They were all subject to inspection. That was one of the requirements of the Interstate Commerce Act, was that all rates had to be, you couldn't charge one rate to one person and a different rate to another person. Everybody had to pay the tariff rate, and the tariff rates were available for public inspection. And the agent was also supposed to be able to provide assistance in looking up a rate, because looking up a rate is not an easy task either, as I might mention that later on. Anyway, so the agent would issue a bill of lading. Ordinarily, it was also the responsibility of the consignor to prepare the bill of lading, but most didn't. The agent ended up doing that. And then, of course, if there was a prepaid shipment, they collected the funds. If it was a collect shipment, they picked up they received the money before releasing the freight. And all those collected funds had to be deposited at a local bank or remitted to the Freight Accounting Bureau. And they were doing that by railroad business mail, where they had a thick envelope. Railroads actually had their own registered mail, and they had wax sealers. The reason why you see these wax sealers turning up on eBay for railroads is because they'd apply wax seals along the back edge of the envelope to prove that it had not been tampered with, or at least so that you could detect whether it's been tampered with. And it went straight to the Freight Accounting Bureau, which opened all that cash and dealt with it if it didn't go to the local bank.
Frank?
Carload freight at stations, they'd also order equipment from a car distributor. If, for example, when I was working and you had somebody loading pulpwood, they were loading 2 or 3 cars a day. They tell you, oh, by the way, for tomorrow, I need another 2 cars. I'm going to load 2 cars tomorrow. So, you had to order the equipment from the car distributor. You also inspected shipments for damage when they arrived. Usually you didn't do that unless the consignee looked for damage. Of course, when you were accepting shipments from the railroad, one of the things on the bill of lading says received in good order. And so the agent was expected to look inside the car, make sure that it was properly loaded. There were parts of the tariff in the classification that said how specific kinds of things had to be loaded. And if there was crates, how did the crate have to be assembled? It just wasn't willy-nilly. And so in the course of doing that, making sure that it was properly packed, they also inspected for damage. If there were loss and damage claims, they would respond to it when the empty car was available or when the loaded car was placed for pickup. They had to notify the responsible party. And then, of course, there's a thing called demurrage that most of you all that were in railroad operations, you were mercifully saved from that responsibility. That's when a car arrived, it had a certain amount of free time, and then it had to, it would go on to a daily charge for detention of the cars. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of times if you were working a local freight crew, you wondered why in the hell you had to go around, switch cars to get a particular car being delivered today. Why not just take the car on the end of the spur or in the yard, put that into the consignee? It was because you had to take the oldest cars first. And so if you were dealing with a stub end track, that meant you had to pull out that car that was probably at the back end, place it out onto a track so that you could couple to it, and then put the rest of the cars back in. And that was the car that was supposed to be allowed to the plant. And if you ran around it, then the shipper was allowed relief in paying demurrage because you were running around cars. You weren't providing the oldest car first. Carload freight at private and blind spurs. Somebody asked a while back what a blind spur was. That's basically a public delivery track. Railroads had those sometimes behind the station or at another location that was called a station, even if there wasn't a station agent there or a station building. Blind spur was just basically a stub end track for public delivery. And private tracks were where the track went onto a property. There was usually a marker that said, that showed where the railroad maintenance ended and where it was the responsibility of the owner of that private track. And those were factories and such. So all of the activities for carload freight at the depot And they also had the responsibility for non-agency stations that were assigned to that agent. They had to provide a daily blind sighting report of cars at the non-agency location, had to provide a private sighting report, and prepare car spotting placement and pickup for the local freight crew. Quite a bit to that, you know. Now we get to less than carload freight that probably nobody on this call has ever seen. I certainly did not, because it pretty much died around 1957 and 58 on most railroads. It may have lasted a little longer in some places, but not much longer than that. The agent was responsible for the receiving, the weighing, and then rating the outbound shipments from the public that exceeded whatever Railway Express would handle. And it usually did not require expedited service. Less than carload freight was not fast. It was pretty reliable. It was sometimes subject to more damage because, you know, how well the less than carload freight was handled in cars between cities, as well as how well it was handled in the peddler car, and then, you know, dropped off of the peddler car onto a cart, taken to the freight house. You know, there's lots more movement for that that could jostle the freight and possibly damage it. So if there were loss and damage claims, it was probably with less than carload freight, a lot of scratch and dent kinds of things. And so transferring the outbound and inbound shipments to the less than carload peddler car, that always traveled in a local freight train. And the specified schedule was usually once a week, sometimes twice a week. It just depended on how much activity there was. Certainly towards the end, it got down to basically once a week. When a shipment arrived, the shipment had to notify the consignee of arrival. They usually did that with postal cards. So if you look on eBay, sometimes you're looking at railroads and postal cards, and you'll see where it's the notification to somebody that their freight has arrived. Less than carload freight, when the person to whom that inbound shipment was received, they had the responsibility of placing it on the dock. And that was where the delivery receipt was signed. It was up to the consignee to go ahead and figure out how to get it into their wagon. And in this era, it was, you know, hauling it away by wagon. They did inspect damaged shipments and process claims. Certainly if there was delayed shipments, or there was, you know, a portion of the list shipment was lost, they had to process that claim. And just like there was detention and demurrage for carload freight, you know, they started assessing storage fees for late pickups. And another note to John, if again, you look up at the word continue, just to the right of that, you see another one of those dry houses. This one is at Buffalo Springs. Yeah, Buffalo Springs.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, okay, all right. And that's a local freight crew. That's evidently the conductor standing out there looking at a switch list. They've pulled the bills out of the box and looking through it, and the brakeman, maybe a couple of brakemen there, are figuring out what they've got to do as far as the local work. So for of course, they also had to account for and collect cash or checks. Checks were fairly uncommon. Certainly there were no credit card payments back then covering the prepaid or collect shipments. If the freight was abandoned, you know, it came on in, nobody ever picked it up, nobody ever acknowledged it. It incurred storage fees, but after a period of time that expired. Then they had to take that abandoned freight back to the peddler car for movement to a location on the railroad where damaged and unclaimed freight was sold. And there were companies that made a business out of bidding on damaged and unclaimed freight, just like for the airlines, damaged and unclaimed bags are just sold at auction. Agents could hire their own freight house labor paid from their own wages, unless it was a really big freight house, lots of business, in which case maybe the railroad did ante up that labor payment. We'll talk briefly about Railway Express because that was really important in the equation of a railroad agent's life. They received, weighed, rated, just like they did for freight, all the shipments, but of course, Railway Express tariffs were different, their requirements and the rates and that were paid and so on. And then on a train, a lot of railroad fans tend to call everything that looks like a baggage car, when in fact, some of those were express cars, some of those were railway post office cars, and really there might only be one or a portion of one car that was truly a baggage car. But that's one of the things that gets lumped together. But Railway Express, many Railway Express cars actually had a messenger in the car to accept and handle shipments and take care of them. So they would transfer any inbound and outbound shipments to the Railway Express car. In later years, that was all substituted by truck. That's when Railway Express started going downhill because there were fewer passenger trains. So they started transferring a lot of shipments, especially to what had been branch line locations, to truck deliveries to a station. Then the shipment arrival notification, just like for less than carload freight or carload freight, was sent to the consignee. When the person came to pick it up, they released it, they inspected it, they traced delayed shipments, and they assessed storage fees for late pickups. That's, again, just like the less than carload freight. So they had to keep their cash and checks separate from the railroad's payment accounts. And then they, again, if there was abandoned Railway Express shipments, they went to a peddler car back to the Railway Express car that went back to where unclaimed express shipments were sold. And then they had to prepare a monthly revenue accounting to receive their Railway Express commission. So one other anecdote is that many station agents, they were looking for how much they could earn at a station. And the railroad wages allowed for an agent operator were pretty much fixed. They were very similar from one station to the next. It may have varied if you were working first trick or second trick or third trick. The daylight operator or daylight agent operator usually earned more because they had responsibility for timekeeping for the other two tricks. So usually second and third trick was not paid. Instead of getting a night premium for work, they got paid less for working nights. But then they had fewer responsibilities. And quite frankly, in my view, and my experience, you had a lot fewer headaches working at night than you did daytime. Certainly there was no maintenance of way work usually going on at night. And you certainly didn't have the supervisors hanging around looking at what you're doing for the most part at night. But one of the things that an agent operator looking at bidding in on a station vacancy would look at is the Railway Express commission. And so if there was a lot of Railway Express or there was a lot of high value express, it actually turned out to be a fairly important part of the decision for an agent to try to go to that office as they had enough seniority. One thing in particular about Boyce, Virginia, it's right at the edge of what's called horse country in Virginia. And so they were shipping what's called fancy stock by Railway Express. That's a code name for racehorses. They were sending them to Hialeah. They were sending them to Saratoga, to compete. I mean, these were high grade horses that were being raised. They just weren't mules. And so for every shipment, you had specialized Railway Express cars, some of which were owned by the railroad, some were owned by Railway Express, that handled horses. And, my general understanding is the commission that the agent earned on just one shipment of racehorses was more than the wages they earned for an entire month from the railroad, and sometimes more. So, that was certainly a consideration why people looked at voice. You had to be very senior to be the voice station agent. And in the entire time between 1913 and 1958 that voice was open as a station, it only had 4 regular agents. Now, another thing was, even if you were posted there for a week or two to cover an absence, those agents did not want you to go around and handling any of the express accounting. You took the money and you noted it, but you left it there for the agent when they got back to do it, because you were not going to get any portion of their Railway Express commission. I suppose somebody probably tried to pull that stunt somewhere along the way. They probably didn't pull it very often before word got around. Coming back into Chris's domain and some of the other people who are Morse telegraph people here, the notes pages have a lot more information than what I'm putting here, much of it to the credit of Chris. He and I had an offline conversation about some of the responsibilities, but in general, telegram messages were received from the public. They had to be rated and then handled according to Western Union tariffs. And if it was a day letter, they were sent immediately, deferred only by the need to handle train orders or a passenger train arrival. So day letters were a premium service for a premium rate. Then you had night letters where somebody could come in during the day and say, oh, well, you can send it tonight. And they were deferred to a time when there was no other immediate task, and the telegraph operator received messages destined for recipients at that office as well. I should say night letters were certainly at a much lower rate. Some of them were per word, some of them were a fixed rate, let's say 40 words and then every word after that. Western Union was certainly trying to encourage night letters almost as much as they were day letters, because it was just additional revenue. Any additional revenue they could get from traffic, especially when it was off hours, was gravy, because they had the fixed infrastructure to take care of the daytime traffic. And usually that was more often oriented towards business and commerce. Night letters were almost always, some sort of communication to a family or something that would say, okay, I'm coming next week. Prepaid collect message fees were received and the funds had to be remitted to Western Union, inappropriate with revenue accounting. So again, that money in the safe, you got 3 different chunks, some of it was railroad, some of it was Railway Express, some of it was Western Union. Telegram messages for a town recipient where there was no messenger were notified by phone if there was phone service in that town that a message arrived, and the agent, either the person would come by and pick up that message from the station, or the agent might choose to deliver the message before or after their on-duty hours. In some cases, the agent might find a boy who hung around the depot outside, and gave him a nice shiny penny if they would run it 5 blocks away to the doctor's house and deliver the message. And of course, it was expected that just as it was for regular messengers in larger cities, that the recipient would tip the messenger. You also communicated with Western Union or the railway's wire chief for line testing and instrument wire difficulties. As Chris can tell you, there was a whole lot more to this aspect. This was no small responsibility of an operator. Just one thing about the background slide, you can see in this case, the block signal is at stop. The train order signal is at stop. So you can actually see one has a flat blade, the other one has an inward curved blade. That was the way it was on the N&W Railway. And John said I had to include this somewhere along the way. So this is really what wireless telegraphy is. So anybody going to send a message to these gals? So with railway operations, first of all, they had to comply with all the responsibilities, safety rules, and operating rules. And the priorities were, number one, communications with the train dispatcher. That was absolutely at the top of the list. Next, anybody that was working in the era when you had people who were at stations, you expected to see the agent and operator on the platform observing passing trains for inspection. If there were two people, happened to be two people at the station, like, maybe somebody from maintenance away happened to be there at the same time, one was supposed to be on the other side of the track. But that was the expectation. You just didn't sit around the office, even if it was raining, even if it was snowing, and look out the window. You were expected to be on the platform. And of course, in that era, when you had cabooses, you had a brakeman. The conductor wanted to stay warm by the stove, so they usually had the brakeman out on the rear platform to watch for any, a high sign from the employees that there was no dragging equipment or anything like that. And of course, we all know what the train inspection consisted of. You weren't just blindly looking at the cars, you were looking for specific things, such as on the top side of the car, if it was cars of lumber and that had bands around it, if there were suddenly bands or anything like that that were dragging around, they had broken and dragged. You had shifted loads, let's say of poles where it looks like they had shifted to one side or from one end of the car to the other. Or more often, you really spent your time looking at the running gear and the trucks, looking for hot boxes and dragging equipment. That was really what you were looking for. It just wasn't, oh, by the way, isn't that a nice train going by? And then waving to the conductor. Certainly copying and handling train orders. That was one part and parcel, I guess, with the communications of the train dispatcher. And then you worked with the wire chief on line issues. Number 5, as we go down the list, this is like, they used to have the late night shows, where the top 10 priorities were, and this one's a little more than 10, but we're going in declining order. Then they serve passenger, express, or freight customers whatever they needed to do to reduce wait time after they had taken care of everything else. Passengers came first, Western Union next, express, then less-than carload and carload freight, and then doing the revenue accounting after they had done just about everything else higher on the list. Messages and correspondence with the general office. You had to spend time doing the tariff filing, preparing rate quotations if somebody wanted them. It was not the expectation that somebody just walk in and you tell them, drop everything you do and give them the rate quotation. That was number 8 on the list. So you did everything else and just told them, come back and I'll have it for you later today. Placing car orders and reports. Then you got in the era when you didn't have electricity, you had to fuel all the lamps and stoves. Did custodial work. You had to sweep the cobwebs from the corners of the building and keep the floor broom clean. Groundskeeping, if the maintenance away section gang wasn't taking care of that, you had to keep that sort of trim. And then again, the favorite railroad direction, the other duties as assigned. Railroad station agents were certainly expected to be involved with the community. They were basically the local sales agent trying to promote passenger and freight services. They were prospecting for new customers. Now, when you think about it, a railroad station agent knew everything about what was going on in the town for everybody. The smaller the town, the more they knew about everybody and everything. They knew the bank in town, they knew the post office in town, they knew who made the blacksmith, no matter what it was, because they handled their freight, they handled their communications by telegraph if it was urgent, they handled their express shipments, they knew what was coming and going, they knew when they were coming and going as passengers and where they were going. So all that information was really used when somebody new showed up in town, they moved into the town. They were really prospecting for new customers and trying to sell them on railroad transportation instead of that newfangled truck transportation that was going down the highway on that highway that they just improved. Certainly they cemented the relationship with existing customers. They did that every day. You know, a lot of these agents were working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. You know, I'm not sure, well, 6 days a week. I think they had Sundays to go to church. And when they were in church, before and after church, they were probably trying to continue the relationship with their existing customers, because customers meant that they had a job. They had every reason in the world to try to keep that continuing relationship going. If there were issues about if there were issues that customers raised, they resolved them or they elevated them. And of course, any local issues that might impact railway operations or business interests, you know, they were expected to tell the general office, it looks like they're building a new building on the lot across the way and doesn't have a railroad spur, might go truck. You know, that was an alert to the general freight agent to try to convince somebody to put in maybe a spur track there. Or if the town, when it had a railroad crossing, was making motions that they wanted to have a local watchman instead of just crossing flashers or nothing at all, you know, they had to communicate that to the general office. They also had to prepare the supplies order, you know, that the stuff that got into their stationery cabinet didn't just show up. They had to prepare requisitions and they sent it to the company warehouse, and there was a supplies train, usually running the system about once a month, that all the requisitions were brought together and the peddler cars were loaded on the warehouse train. And when it got to a particular station, you know, agent was out to meet it, and they signed for the supplies that they had requisitioned. The weekly deposits of cash at the bank, all those accounting records had to go to the central accounting office. Any company messages should go by the message line if they were urgent, but more importantly, the railroads were saying, don't use the telegrams, company telegraph more than you have to. Use railroad business mail. And and in fact, if a recipient down in the general office got a company message by telegraph that it didn't consider to be time sensitive, you know, it would report that to the wire chief, and that telegraph operator would get a reprimand for not sending it as railroad business mail. Other duties assigned. This is the last slide for that. These railroad agent operators also did the employee training for the next generation of people that would succeed them. You know, they knew who the local people were who might qualify for a railroad career. Usually that person had to be pretty good in high school, had to be literate, had to have some ear for telegraphy, and, you know, would do the ad hoc teaching of prospective telegraph operators, agents, and clerks, teaching them Morse code, operating and safety rules, accounting procedures, and depot operations. You know, there was no additional pay to the agent for that. The person might reach the point, the student might reach the point where they were considered as a student and they were receiving posting pay. That didn't really come along until some of the later union agreements. You know, in the early days, you basically train people, and then when you thought they were ready, you sent them down to the wire chief or to the chief dispatcher, and that person gave them a rules test, tested them on the Morse code, and you know, they were hired or they were not. So now we're going to go through a typical work day, just so we've got everything in sequence. You know, the first thing you do is, if this is for a station that's not working continuously 24 hours a day, you come on in and unlock the depot, you turn on the train order light, You remove patch plugs from the message wire and send a message GM with a station call sign to the dispatcher. Dispatcher would respond GM and the station call sign back to let you know that they heard you and knew that you were on duty. You'd also unlock the office safe and you count all the coins, checks, everything, and you confirm it against the previous business days on-hand cash reports. Now, the reason you did this, even if you were the same agent that closed the safe the night before, was just in case somebody had burglarized your safe and happened to know the combination and was in the office undetected. You had to be sure that you were starting out the day with what you ended up the previous day. And if not, you had a basis for then noticing the discrepancy and calling the local sheriff, reporting it to the railroad police, and getting an investigation going because something's not right. That's what in later years. I know when I was working on the railroad, there were practically no cash receipts, so they were just keeping pencils in the safe. But I was schooled early on, that no matter what it is, even if it's only pencils in the safe, you unlock it and you open it and you check to see what was in there from the previous day is still there. Of course, outside on the station, there was a box for the waybills, or they might be in a phone booth near the station. You go out and pick up the waybills for cars that were delivered, and then you prepare the postal card arrival notices for freight and express shipments. All the while, of course, you might be online with the dispatcher. Train might arrive. You might be OSing the train passing. You might have been out there observing the train, but this is still the general sequence. Then, if there was a lull, you'd go to the local post office to pick up or send any mail that was postal mail. And then, of course, as the passenger trains came on in, the baggage men would give you the railroad business mail. And that was usually on the local passenger train, if not other trains as well. You updated demurrage records and filed waybill copies, prepared bills of lading for the outbound carload, lesson carload, and express shipments. You filed tariff supplements that were received. And then at 12 noon, that's the magic time of the day. That's when everything on the railroad stops except for the train movements. You pause at 12 noon for the time pulse beat to reset your depot clock and watch. And if there were any other people, any other railroad employees, they all hang around there. And, again, they're looking at their watches and resetting it to 12 noon. You then also advise the train dispatcher of significant weather changes when appropriate. You get to the afternoon, somewhere along in the day, you really didn't have a fixed lunch hour. You just sort of had that sandwich on the end of the table, and you'd take a bite of it whenever you could do it, and might have a cup of coffee that you were sipping on. You obtain lineups and track requests for maintenance away forces when they were requesting them. You inspected passing trains for defects, as well as display of markers. If there were carload freights, cars that were ready for dispatch, you went out and sealed those. You send the next day's car order to the car distributor by the message line, send notification messages and switching instructions to the local freight conductor to the operator at the office, where the local freight conductor would receive its initial clearance card. My example for that on the C&O is if I was working at Beaver Dam Station, one of the responsibilities before I closed up the office was to send a message to Gordonsville Tower called G Cabin, and the operator there would transcribe the message that said that there were 5 cars to be picked up and 2 empties to be set out at the local siding, and the bills are in the box, the telephone box near the depot. So you had to get that message to that office. You also then reconciled the funds in the office safe and prepared the on-cash reports, left the waybills in the cars and local freight spotting instructions in the depot bills box. And then the best part of the day for you, you signed on to the dispatcher's wire, did GN with the station call sign, to the dispatcher, and they responded GN with the station call sign, GN being good night. And you inserted patch plugs on the message wire, turned off the train order light, and you locked up the depot. All that typical workday for most of the time before you had the 8-hour work days, it was a 12-hour day. So now we're getting to some of the best part of this presentation, like a summary. I've had communication with a fellow named Dennis Nauman. He was a former NNW agent operator. In later years, he was a power director, where he was making sure doing the power locomotive allocation across the system and repositioning power, basically a dispatcher for locomotives system wide. But he started out as a station agent and operator, got a good foundation in what they did. And, basically he viewed the station agent as the master of the railroad. We won't make any comparisons about people who have been recently identified as geniuses, but he was definitely a genius in so many ways, because he had to figure out how to do things effectively and efficiently during the period of time that he was working at the station. The main takeaway for this is that depot buildings were multifunctional and the personnel were multitasking. They didn't just sit there and sell tickets or hand out timetables. The priorities were railroad operations first, then passenger, express, telegram, freight service, agency documentation, and building care, in that order. And the agents were expected to know the operating rules, traffic management procedures, and communications. The depot agent was the face of the railroad to the local community. And typically an agent lived in the town where the agent worked, or he at least lived nearby. And prior to the increasing frequency of agency closures, most agents remained at a station for many, many years. Agency selection was through seniority bids. Best part of the whole presentation is the questions slide. So now, if you have any questions or comments or want to elaborate, and John, what I thought I'd do, a lot of times we get into sharing some photographs. I've also got an album of some Temple cartoons that I can scroll through. I haven't queued it up yet. If people want to look at those, many of the subjects were station agent operators. Harry Temple was an agent operator himself. So his drawings are about as realistic as a drawing could be. So with that, any questions, comments, or anything else? The contact information is there at the bottom right. And as I mentioned, if you did not receive this presentation as a PDF file, my email address is in the chat window. Please send me an email and request it. Likewise, save that email address. If you have questions later on, just send me a note.
That was pretty thorough, Frank. That was a beautiful presentation, a lot of detail. It brings back a lot of memories. I went into tower service and then I went into station service. And there were many days I was better off staying in tower service. A lot of work there.
A lot of work. And in towers, the thing that I liked about working in towers is you're mostly by yourself, unless you were a big one where you had levermen and some other positions. But you were by yourself. Nobody really hassled you. General public didn't come in and complain. You just took care of railroad operations. You worked 8 straight hours. You went home. You didn't worry about it. As a station agent, some of that, as in later years with other careers, you ended taking home some of those worries, accounting issues. Why can't somebody pick up their freight? You're worried about things off the job as much as you did on the job. And so that's something that's not well documented, but certainly I think impacted it. It was a pretty tough job. You certainly earned your pay.
Hey, Frank.
Yes.
It's Rick Silva here. I could explain those cable boxes at the top of the telephone poles better from a diagram that I have of them to explain why they were there and why they were mounted the way they were up there. If I could have the screen for a minute.
Yeah, you're welcome to. And I'll come back to this one because with Chris online, you can see actually this interior photograph, you can see some of the other communications like bells and pegboard and so on like that. I just wanted to go through some of that. But let me, first of all, I got to get out of stop share.
Ouch.
Okay, now you should be able to share your screen. While you're doing that, I'm going to queue up that other one that about the temple cartoons, but you should be able to do yours now.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what we're looking at here is these cable boxes at the top of the poles. This, of course, is a different pole than the type that was at that station. This is an H pole, but the cable box is the same. And the reason they were mounted high up above the cross arms, like that picture that Frank had up at that station was a single cross arm, and the box was mounted way up high, is that back in the day when they went to more communication wires for the teletypes and telephones, they of course required more cross arms than the old days when they just had a couple of iron telegraph wires. And back in that day, let's pick 1910 or 1915, in that era, insulation on wires was in its infancy, and the line wires didn't have insulation on them, and there were no drop wires with insulation at the time. So, but there were lead sheath cables that had paper insulation. Okay, so to get the line drop from the line wire down into the station, they brought a lead cable from the station all the way up the telephone pole into this cable box. Now, remember, the lead cable, the wires were insulated with paper. There was no plastic, or they weren't using rubber or jute or any of those early insulations yet. So what they did was they brought the cable from the station up the pole into these cable boxes, and then they used a bare wire conductor to go from the line wire insulator. As you can see, each one has got its own wire going to the cable box. Those wires have no insulation on them, and they were all separated at that cable box. And then they were soldered into a wire connection inside the cable box that then was hooked to the lead cable drop that went into the station. So this was early on, and later on, when insulation became better, the line drops didn't need this cable box anymore, or they just dropped they could do away with these bare conductor drops like it's shown in the diagram here. But that's why those cable boxes existed. They were done away with early on, and once the drops could be brought directly into the station without the lead cable or the bare conductor line drops that you see here. And the linemen hated these things because they were prone to getting bees inside them, and the honeybees love to build their nests inside these things and fill them with honeycombs. They were a real pain to maintain, and the linemen couldn't wait till they were all eliminated. But I just thought I'd put that out there because it was a legitimate question early on, and I know guys told me about these early, when I first worked on the railroad, so I knew a little bit about them. So just wanted to put that out there.
That's a great explanation.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that tells it all. So that explained, John, what you were looking for?
It does. I'm trying to figure out how you got 40 wires into that box and kept them separate.
Yeah, because if you look at the side view, all right, the left-hand side is the front view, and then there's a side view. Each one of those wires goes into the box, and they're all separated. So you can look at the detail on it. And if you enlarge that photograph, you'll see that each one goes into
Yeah.
the side of the box separately. And there was like a porcelain tube there to bring it inside to keep everything separated from shorting out to another wire.
Okay. Wow.
They told me they were a pain in the ass to maintain. And of course, and they were full of bees, and everybody hated them and couldn't wait till they were done away with. Of course, plastic or rubber insulation and those early on installations changed everything so they could eliminate all this and go with the way it was in my era. Because I never saw one of these except from photographs. They were all long gone before I came around on the railroad. But
I have a photograph that kind of shows one of these. If you want me to show that.
Yeah, go ahead and show it.
Go ahead, yeah,
Chris.
I'll take this down.
Okay, let me, their screen.
How do I get off this thing? There.
Okay, you can see the wires going up into the box.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, one thing that I'd like to add to what has been said, what Rick said, you know, really the whole pole line was a pain in the ass to maintain. You know, you had miles and miles, and Chris can certainly elaborate upon this, that, you know, there was a responsibility by Western Union for maintaining the pole line and the wires for a period of time. And then at some point, the railroad took over that responsibility as they started adding, when you had automatic block signals systems or CTC, next thing you know, they had a responsibility for doing that. Yeah, that's a great picture there.
Yeah, you can see the cable going into the station. Plus, you'll notice there's two insulators with bare wires. That's the local phone service coming to the station.
Yeah, right. And you could see facing away from you at the top of the box is another one of those dry spots, as I call it.
Yeah.
But you know, in addition to keeping the pole line maintained, you also had the maintenance away section gang had to trim the grass around the pole line. The last thing you wanted was a bunch of trees and brush growing into the pole line, because that would short out the wires. So it was a very expensive proposition to try to maintain that pole line, but certainly at the point where you had stations and you had these boxes that certainly added to the maintenance expense. What I was going to do is, let me go back up to that. Let me share my screen again. Let me go back to this presentation. Let me go back to back once. Oh, come on, let's move here. No, we want to go this way. Chris can also chime in. This is the only good station view that I've got. Up at the upper left that you can barely see is a box that had a selector mechanism in it. And so the dispatcher on their dispatcher's desk could send a code, and if they wanted to ring a particular office to get them online because they weren't answering their office call, they could do that. It was particularly used in the telephone era. That wasn't really a telegraph activity. Then next to that, you have what looks like a pair of bells. That's because they're bells. If you had a block line, then you know, a magneto ringer would ring those bells. And so there were rings. Usually, if you had a block line, the one end of it was a one long ring. And then at the other, for the office at the other end of a block line, it was two shorts, let's say. And block line existed for its name. It was the way in which, that was the line in which two offices would go around and block trains to confirm that, you know, there were no trains in the block before they would clear their block signal and communicate with the dispatcher. Below the word Norfolk is the pegboard. That's where the telegraph wires came into that pegboard, and you could connect it to the instruments that were on the desk. You could also cut in instruments, or you could change wires. Some larger offices had a more complex wet pegboard or patch board that had many more wires, most of which just went through the office, but they sectioned there so that if there was line trouble, the operator could be directed for doing patching around whatever the trouble was. Immediately below that is the local resonator box and sounder. And basically that box is much like an amplifier. And to the very far left, where it says thank you, and then you see a piece of paper, and then something to the left of that, that's a relay. And that is a relay for the telephone, for the telegraph line. The operator could listen to the relay. Sometimes they had mainline sounders there as well. And they would, when they heard their office call or wanted to then send a message, that's when they would shift to that line to the local sounder and the key that you can't see as key because it's underneath the, well, I guess there is a key right underneath thank you. That's to the left of his left hand. And then up above, you have some other porcelain kinds of knife switches. Those are evidently for a telephone lines, because telegraph required one wire and telephone required two wires to make a circuit. At the right, probably unique to the Norfolk and Western Railway, the levers rotated. They had these paddles that said no orders or orders, and they would rotate as you'd move that lever forward or back. And of course, the Seth Thomas clock on the wall, that was a subject of attention at 12 o'clock noon. Any other questions? And do you all want to see some Temple cartoons, or do you want to talk about something else?
Yeah, Jim Murphy on here. Can you hear me? Okay.
Loud and clear.
Okay, I'm looking at this stuff. All of these fixtures you see on the wall in there, the clock, the handles, I've got all that stuff here at my house by the piles. Would you believe it? The lever system, I just sold a set of them just exactly like that without the two signs for $1,000 for the pair.
Yeah.
The guy is setting him up at his house to run his signal out in his backyard that he's got up. He got a 25-foot high post up there, and he's putting the signal up there. They'll run from inside his garage. So, but I'm looking at this stuff and all the things you've talked about on these jobs. I started here on the CV in 1955 when it was strictly train orders. We didn't have any block signals like you're saying on it. We had strictly a train order signal up on the roof with three position. We were train orders. We had 18 stations when I came to work, and I worked 16 of them started from 1955 up until when I went dispatching in 1968. But everything you say, when I first started out, I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I was going to go and use the telegraph and everything. Then I found out it had to be accounting, record keeping, and all that stuff. So I learned an awful lot in all those years. Then I left the railroad and came back again in 1980 when the railroad called me back. And I got back in full train dispatching. But I've been collecting this stuff ever since late 1980s. When the railroad was sold, I moved 25 pickup material from the general office building, which included the valuation maps for the original valuation maps of 1916 of the whole railroad from the Canadian border to New London, Connecticut. I have over 2,000 prints like that in my collection, which I'm sharing with other groups all over. When somebody calls me up, I'm able to almost take care of them on the Central Vermont Railway. So, but I know what you're saying, that the job is quite a job. You did everything in the morning. You open up in the morning, you keep the fire going, you got the lineup for the section men. You went out there and checked on any mail coming in, and the Railway Express, the first class mail you had to put on the train and take it off. So we handled everything. The Western Union, I had a telegraph wire went into Boston. And that was, we had 3 wires in every station. But just to bring it up, Frank, this has really been great. I printed out your whole thing you had there yesterday for I could have it to read through it. So it's incredibly great. Thank you.
Well, I certainly appreciate the comments, Jim, and I'm glad we had our offline discussion too. And by the way, first of all, it's nice to see you. It's different when you just do email and you don't have any idea what somebody looks like and all. But I also want to
Kind of fuzzy.
yeah, right. But I also like that clock on your wall. It looks like one of the Western Union clocks that's self-winding, one of
there.
the self-winding clocks.
No, that's the big number 8, Seth Thomas. Came
Oh.
from the superintendent's office here in St. Albans. Eddie Valley had it, and he retired in 1966, went home, and it sat around at his house for years and years and years. And then he finally, before he passed away, he told his wife, Gwen, when I'm gone, give the clock to Jim. And it's an 1890s clock, and it's not running right today, but it's an original river clock. I have 9 clocks here at the house too, all the way from E. Howard's to Seth Thomas, you name them, I've got them. So
Well,
Too much.
that alone is impressive. It certainly is. Let me, we can keep on talking, but let me go ahead and stop there. Well, don't
Can I-
forget.
I show you one picture here.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
don't know if you can see this here.
Yeah. Oh, that's, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's
That's
not me.
it.
That's Truman Breyer. He's 94 years old, was an operator dispatcher, still around. But that set up there is one I set up in the museum here in St. Albans to look like back in the 1920s or so. It's all operational in it, so it all works.
Well, that's great. Is he a member of the Morse Telegraph Club?
Yes, I am. Yep.
And he is too?
And Chris is the one that got me in here.
Oh, yeah. Well, it goes without saying. Chris is a Keystone, not from the Keystone State, he's from Rochester, but he's certainly a Keystone. Let me just run through these cartoons. Some of them you've seen, some of them you haven't.
Oh, nice.
Harry
Oh, there we
Temple
are.
was- Huh?
That's nice.
This is back in the day, you know, I'm not going to read the captions to you. I'll whip through these pretty quickly, but
We can't see them. We can't see them.
oh, okay. It
How
says
do
on-
I
it
get off the
says
screen
on
here?
screen sharing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's,
hang on.
Hello, hello,
yeah,
Frank.
screen sharing up.
Yeah.
Hey, Frank,
Yeah,
I just wanted to throw this in here real quick before you started the other show there. Remember you talked about those knife switches
yeah.
for communications? There they are right there in this photograph right here. The smaller stations had knife switches instead of a plug board to open and close the line.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, and I installed this down at the tower in South Norwalk. It's a pretty neat piece that I found on eBay, and but it kind of explains you could open the line north or east or south or west, depending on the direction, and you could also the center knife switch opened the you could isolate the inside instruments from lightning inside the station. You could see that there's a set of terminals there for the telephone set inside the building and the selector equipment. And I just thought I'd put that there because you mentioned it in your presentation there.
Did you want to share that screen? Because I didn't see the photograph that you're speaking of.
Oh, you can't see.
Here, let
Is
me
it-
stop sharing.
Can anybody else see it?
Yeah,
Yes,
No, I can
yes.
see. Okay, I
Yep,
see
we
the
can-
knife switches. Where is this picture at?
This is down at the Sono Switch Tower Museum.
Oh, it's at Sono.
Yeah, that's all the equipment that I installed there a couple of years ago, and the
You and Stinky.
The knife switches are was something I found online, and I thought it made a nice display there. But it explained, I just thought that the way you showed it in that picture was probably one of the only other pictures I've seen of it actual mounted on the wall, like you had, like I did it here. And here was stationed on the N&W that you had there. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, well, some of the other things in your picture too, I think are noteworthy. I mentioned the bells that were in that other picture, the magneto with the crank there, the floor switch, And the jack box there lets you switch from line to line. I never worked at a station that had a loudspeaker that looked like that, but I did work at stations where you had basically a squawk box, you know.
What we did here was we have the telegraph and then the telephone, the scissor phone that came after, and then the black phone in the center goes with the green speaker. That was the telephone system that replaced everything else in 1966. So what we did was three different eras of railroad communications here.
Yeah. Good.
Until all of it was replaced eventually by just regular telephones. And
Well, that's great.
everybody's got cell phones today. I'll take
One
this
of these
down.
days I need to get up to Sonos. So that's on the to-do list. I just don't know when.
How do I get this thing off the screen? My name is jumped up there and I can't get it off.
I'm going to have to ask the Zoom master about that. I'm not sure, but
I don't know what the problem is. Are you trying to show us a picture?
No, I'm trying to get off the screen because I've been popping up full screen all the time and I'm trying to kick myself off and I can't get rid of me.
Put your camera off.
Where am I? So I start there.
Hey, John, if I could interrupt a moment.
Yes, Charlie.
I just wanted to say Jeff Otto has joined us. I don't know when he got on, but I just wanted to introduce him, the president of the O&W Society.
Charlie, just hang on
No.
because him and I are doing a chat window, and
Okay.
right now, okay, just hang on.
Okay,
He
I
seems
don't know how long
this-
he could stay.
Yeah, I'm in contact with him right now.
Okay.
And I hope you stay on, Charles.
The female up. Bring that other picture back.
this one here,
Oh wow.
these are all cartoons that Terry Temple did. A lot of accuracy in his pictures, you know. And that's obviously a brakeman who kept on trying to fancy up to some female clerk or a female operator. A lot of this is not appropriate for 2022, but that's the way it goes. Railroad stories are a great, I mean, Harry Temple cartoons in 1930s are when these cartoons are mostly there. And this is something obviously you don't see anymore. I've never understood the other person up on the roof of the caboose. I certainly understand, you know, somebody, a brakeman or somebody, you know, getting on while the caboose is moving. That's the purpose of that curved handrail. This is one of my favorites. That's a young kid. It's called the Deadhead, you know, getting the ride of his life behind the engineer. You know, it wasn't all bad on some of those night tricks, you know, so a lot of the guys were musically inclined. In fact, some people ended up into recording careers. You know, they were talented musically, and I'm drawing a blank on who I want to say. I can't remember if it was Gene Autry or who it was, but anyway, the other thing is, if you notice at the bottom, there's some insulators on the bottom of the chair, and that's as much to make it to slide on the floor. Some people thought it was to provide insulation so that you wouldn't get shocked using telegraph equipment, but it seems to be that the real reason was just it slid easier, made that chair slide easier on a wood floor. Railroad Girl. Everybody loves sex in the railroad magazines, so you know there's certainly plenty of topics about that. And you know, wherever she was, I guess everybody came on in and gathered around. Here's the agent. I guess there's a bum who's just sleeping on the cart. and he's telling him better wake up or whatever. Maybe she's there just because he's sleeping because he's waiting for the train to come, but other duties is assigned. This apparently that I don't know about this, but back in the day when you couldn't dim headlights, you'd actually have something that you go out on the front of the locomotive and put over the headlight to dim it. And in that case, it had perforations in it so that it had the engine number 101. So the approaching engine crew could see what it was and know that's who they were supposed to meet.
That's for real?
That's
for real?
This for real? Well,
Yeah.
again, these are cartoons, but
Yeah.
Harry Temple was, he was back there. He was at the turn of the century, and his railroad career was early. And his sketches are fairly historically accurate, not necessarily to a particular railroad, but certainly of a particular era. He captures a lot that most of it was never pictured. I mean, who would have been able to take a night photograph of somebody doing something like this, So
Right.
sometimes these cartoons, I'll leave it to somebody else to judge. Oh yeah, is that really historically accurate? But I've got no reason to dispute it. I don't think he made it up.
Yeah, I've read this in a number of different places and it was required. And that was the reason. So an approaching train would know he was meeting the train that his train order said he was to meet.
Yeah.
Damn.
So everything got easier when you had electric light switches, John. You just turn that switch in the cab and you just sat there. This is a conductor in the caboose. He's going around trimming the wicks on all of his lanterns and stuff like that. You just do that when you don't have anything else to do. A station agent, or it's supposed to be station agent because he's got a station agent's hat on, is hanging the pouch for a train. A lot of times it was a mail messenger that would actually handle the catcher pouch at a station. But I won't try to dispute Harry Temple.
What are the dates on these books, Frank? The dates on this?
They're in my file name. This one is from the December 1939 railroad. It's a cover. And I can tell you, I can see the file name. You may not be able to as I go through these. But this is December 1939.
Yeah, they're nice. I've seen a couple of these and they were always fun to read.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's some great recollections, lots of, they used to call the telegraph operators and brakemen and so on that go around the system from one railroad to the next. They called them boomers. And that certainly was in the era before I worked with the railroad, but fascinating tales that they had to tell. This is in that same issue, December 1939. Page 37 of Railroad Magazine. And here the wire chief has gotten on the line and wants him to try to separate a wire. So he's gone over there and it's, it says ground number 10 east, say when. And, that's what he's doing for trying to isolate a line for line testing with the under the supervision of the wire chief.
Yeah.
So there's a snow delay. Obviously, the conductors come on in where it's warm and just waiting it out while the train's sitting outside and the operator's in there, waiting for some sort of clearance or something and stay in communications with the dispatcher about the delay. I guess this is probably the rear end brakeman dropping off so that he can flag the train. And then this is the conductor, flagman. I guess the flagman is the one who carries all the marker lamps, hand lamps and flags, and giving the little daughter a kiss as he goes off to work. This is from June of 1939. And then the conductor coming on in and shouting, "Next stop is." And then when you had people who were in the order of railway telegraphers and they were booming around the country, you know, they almost traveled like hobos. But, you know, if you showed your ORT card to an operator, they do what they could to try to get you on a train to go wherever you're going. So that's basically what this operator's doing, you know. He's asking the conductor if he's willing to go ahead and haul the guy, even though he doesn't have a railroad pass. And here's a hobo who's just wondering from the station agent if he's got anything heading south. I guess he'd like to go all the way down to where you are, John, way down south. Although with springtime, it's not so bad. Just a front cover magazine, 1940, February 1940. And Lincoln Pin. You know, I've heard stories that if you were a brakeman and you were a boomer operator and boomer brakeman, and you were looking for a job, you went into the superintendent's office. Superintendent would say, "Let me see your hands." And if you were missing one or more fingers, he knew you were experienced, and that was your resume. He'd hire you on the spot if they had a vacancy. That was a pretty cruel way to run a railroad, but that's the way it was done until you had the Janney coupler.
Well, they were supposed to use a wooden ballot to lift those links, but nobody wanted to do that.
Yeah, use a brake club, you know. Brake club was probably more effective against hobos than it was. Well, some of those hand brakes were down on pretty tight. You wound it up with a brake club, and sometimes they were pretty hard to release too. So, but yeah, they were supposed to hold it up with something else. You know, they sometimes they were too sure of themselves and would hand hold it up with their hand. And of course, you know, just being in between the rails, that alone is a significant risk. Come on, let's go.
This is some really great stuff.
Oh yeah, these cartoons are wonderful. Well, you know, here's the nice old station agent. It's Christmas. And did you go to the Christmas tree lot to get your Christmas tree back then? No, you got your Christmas tree sent by Railway Express. And kids are looking for their Christmas tree. They're going to put it on their sled and take it home and decorate it. Oh, and I like that, this caption, some, I guess, people, instead of calling the dispatcher a dispatcher, they called him the detainer, you know, and the engineer says he's got a hot pin, he's not moving. That's the tower operator came on down and talking to the engineer to try to get him to move out of the way because he's blocking the main line. And then again, this is another situation, Brotherhood card, you know, he's don't know what Brotherhood, but conductor takes a look at it. And a lot of times a Brotherhood card would get you on a train. Spring fever, you had to clean the station, you know, you had to clean the stove, you had to clean the oil lamps, you know, and you also got tired, you know, the sun came up a little earlier in the morning and went down a little later at night, and in between trains you might doze. So there was plenty to do at a station. All indications this is supposed to be, you know, 12:40, I guess, something in the afternoon just after lunch, but time for an afternoon nap. Back in the morning and the evenings, you took your velocipede, and if you had the switch stand down at the end for a passing siding or whatever, mainly in manual block territory, it was your responsibility as a station agent and operator to clean those lamps and then go down there and put them back on the mast. So you took them down in the morning, took them back to the station to clean it because you had the target there. You could see that during the daylight, but then by night you had to have everything all cleaned up and had to go back down and put the lamps back on there, refueled and cleaned so that they were visible at night. And so here's somebody, they're just sitting around talking, they're in the hole. And, here's the station agent looking wistfully at the, some of the people who you should never walk on the rail, but that doesn't keep the people from the city visiting the country, trying to show off, walking down the track. And then this is, the watch inspector, as many of you all in operating positions know, you went on into the watch inspector. Sometimes they would give you a loaner watch. The watch inspector, some large railroads had their own watch inspector. In other cases, they had, just like they had local physicians that were the local railroad physicians, they had a local jeweler that would take care of watches. So this is just an image of, going ahead and getting your watch inspected. You had to have that done, I think, at least every year, if not every half year, getting it cleaned, lubricated, and reset. And
His covers are beautiful.
Yeah, this is 1941 October cover of Railroad magazine. Drawbar flagging. This is the guys, when you flag a train, don't stand 10 feet back behind the train. You're supposed to go back a further distance to be able to allow the train adequate time to stop.
2 miles.
That's not what this flagman does. He's got like a baseball cap on there. Who knows if he's really taking his responsibility seriously, but there he is, just a few feet from the back of the train, and he's out flagging the train. He's not doing the job right. And then when you had a snowstorm, wires are down, rights over everything. That motor car and the lineman, they aren't budging. They're not going to get down to move that motor car so the train can go by. They're up there to try to get the communications line open.
That's Rick Silva.
Yeah. I'll tell you, everybody thinks about jobs, it's nice to be outside. When you're out in the winter trying to climb a pole, it's icy, you're trying to go around and wires are down. They've been, the ice has caused them to sag or sometimes break. That was one hell of a job, and those, as I call them, dry boxes, they were a headache. The whole pole line, as far as I'm concerned, was a headache. The railroads could not have gone to, cable and later microwave and then later radio communications soon enough, as far as I'm concerned. And they've got a 19 train order. A lot of times the train crew, in the summer, you just had the windows of the agent's office open and the operators in there writing the order. Everybody sort of clusters around there while somebody else is going around unloading freight down further on the platform or whatever on the local freight, and they're just waiting for the operator to finish the meat order or whatever else they're going to give the train and engine crew. This is one of Chris Hostler's favorite pictures. It's the fantasy of every young operator that there you are, you're dressed in finery, you got a clean job, and it's no back-breaking work. It's sometimes mentally exhausting. And now you're showing off for the young lady in town who probably has never seen anybody from a larger city stop by, and she's impressed with the tie, the suit. She may not be impressed by the pinups on the clock, but the guy wears a nice hat. It's everything that a early 20s something could wish for. And this is back in 1942.
One of our members, he's not on tonight, he's been on these meetings a couple times, sent me an email some years ago that said that he, as a young man, he saw this cover, and it's what made him want to become a telegraph operator.
Well, and I'll tell you a story. One of the places I worked was Mineral, Virginia. And there was a guy that I knew later in his career named Buddy Mahanes. His HA, it was HA Mahanes. Everybody called him Horse's Ass, but it was Buddy Mahanes. And he was not only the second trick operator at G Cabin, he was the local chairman for BRAC. At that time, it was BRAC. And then he also was the head of the volunteer fire department, and he was justice of the peace. So he was big stuff in Gordonsville. But what he used to do, he was working for Mineral. Mineral was one of the unusual stations that had a patch board that where all the lines on the pole broke and came into that patch board. So that included commercial lines of all sorts, you know, not just Western Union, but your commodities lines, news wires, and all of that. And some of those were hot wires, you know, going between major relay offices. So what he used to do around lunchtime, there was a millinery factory around the corner from the station. Summertime, he had the window open, and the girls who were working there would come out and they'd sit in the shade on the shady side of the station, which was the front of the station, sit on the platform that's elevated for the freight room. And, you know, they come on by the window and give them in the eye. And what he would do is sit at a typewriter. He was trying to improve his Morse proficiency. That's where I'm going on this. What he'd do is he'd plug in to one of the news wires where they were transmitting, you know, 40, 50 words a minute. They were a lot faster than just what you did for railroad. And he'd be typing away, whether or not he was typing the actual words or not. He was putting on a good show, and they were going ooh and ah, you know. So that lasted for quite a while, and you know, it's there were a lot of people, and of course the ubiquitous spike on the pad. Spikes were often used as paperweights. So when you had the windows open, things to blow around. What easier way to hold them down than to you know, do that. And there's a plug actually for Railroad magazine behind the agent you see, or that operator, probably a relief operator, just in town for the first time. Just happens to be an issue of Railroad magazine laying on the counter.
Hey, Frank.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just hold up for 1 second a bit here. These are really good, but I just want to say something before he may have to sign off. Jeff Otto is on here, and Charlie, you can tell everybody who he is, and I'd like Jeff to do a program for us on the OW. I mentioned that earlier this evening. Charlie, you want to introduce Jeff?
Oh, okay. I can't see him, but yeah, Jeff is the president of the
I
New
can
York,
stop sharing
Ontario.
my screen.
Oh, he's
Yeah, I'll
somewhere
stop
out there.
sharing.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
No, that's okay. He's the president
that's
of the NYO&W Society, and they do a nice job with their magazines and books and everything. And Jeff, if you'd like to say hello to everybody, and hopefully you'll be able to join us one day with a presentation.
And hopefully I won't be an hour and a half late like tonight. So sorry to join so late.
You made a wrong turn. Huh?
Yeah, right. Sorry to miss the program too. It looks, the little bit I saw, it looked good. So anyway, so you guys seem to have a friendly meeting, which is the whole idea, and informative.
Yeah. Charlie told me your meetings are generally focused on one subject matter, and you don't have a bullshit session. And we do a lot of that, you know, a little bit before the show and then after the show. Most of the people on here, probably 60% of them are from the railroad. Different railroads. I got them across the country, and I got them up in Canada.
Yeah, that makes you guys a very special group. I worked for the Erie Lackawanna a couple months, or a couple summers rather, and so that's pretty trivial compared to what you guys have all done. So yeah, I'm very impressed. In terms of our meetings, we have about usually over 100 attendees. So I don't do it as meetings, I do it as a webinar. Which means that only the people that I specifically enable to be on the screen are on the screen, the ones that give reports. We have a regular meeting with reports, even some silly voting and stuff. And then we have the presentation. And we do Q&A for discussing the presentation. But if we potentially brought 100 people on the screen, it would be a zoo. So I haven't even attempted that.
Charlie told me about that, and the only people on here are people I invite, or if they ask me if they can invite somebody. We do not put this out on the internet. There's all kinds of bullshit problems if you do that.
Oh, of course.
So that, yeah, they got Zoom buttons out there. But perhaps you could do a program on the ONW one night. And if you want us, next week is our tower meeting. So as you say, it's more formal. It takes place down at the Sono Switch Tower, and they'll do. The members are right there. It's more formal than this is for about an hour and a half. Then they all go home, and then we continue to bullshit.
Very good. Well, our meetings, by the way, are members only because we have hundreds of members.
Yeah.
And so it's only by invite, like you just said you do. But it would just be too much to handle. So anyway, it sounds like what you guys do is pretty fun, though.
Yeah, it is. And I have you give me your number, and I'll talk to you. And if you could tell me when the last time was you talked to Martin Leroy, the guy right below you, Chris House.